Welcome, I'm Michael Bickert. Thanks for joining me today as we explore concepts with the objective of improving your management skills and growing your business. I am very happy to see you already have your notepads and pens handy. For those of you who don't, grab those right now because I want you to make a commitment that you'll take notes. I want you to make a commitment that you will jot down some sort of action item that you can implement in your business today. That's what this is all about, implementation to drive your business forward. And we are continuing our discussion regarding waste and becoming a more effective manager and becoming a better business, innovating through the elimination or the minimization of waste. And we are on the back nine, or we're in the second half. Choose your sports metaphor here. We've already covered 4 forms of waste, and today we are going to focus on the 5th one. And these are not in any chronological order. Today we're going to cover defects, and I would say that defects is the most intuitive or the most obvious form of waste. I don't have to tell you that a defect in your product or service is wasteful. We intuitively understand that. And still, it would be helpful to delve in a little bit, do a deeper dive and take a look at this. And first we're going to examine some basic premises behind or underlying the concept of a defect. And I want you to pay close attention to those, and then we'll go into some causes. And while we're going through this, remember, bear in mind that my examples and the things, the bullets that I bring up won't be relevant to each of you each and every time. I try to make these as universal as possible, but of course it does to a certain degree depend on your business and your industry, whether you offer physical products or you offer services, but you can apply most of this across the board. Now, if you are unfamiliar with the whole concept of waste and Muda, go back and watch our original 2 or 3 videos on that, and then you can get into these individual videos on the playlist where we cover each of these individually. But as we go through it, make notes as to your business and pause the video from time to time, jot down something and go, you know what, that is something I need to look closer at. And again, like I say, make that commitment to yourself that you will implement some sort of improvement in your business today. It's not really just a good thing to watch this and come up with good ideas. I don't believe in that. I want to be impactful. I want to affect change. So what I'm saying may not resonate with you specifically, but find something, commit to something. And it might be something that I stimulate in your brain that has nothing to do with defects in your product or service, but you think, you know what, that reminds me of this other thing, and then jot that down and implement that. You can always come back to this concept of defects. Anyway, once again, I'm going to put some notes up on the screen that you can follow along. Those aren't the notes I'm asking you to take. You will be able to download those. Just add your name and email address on the link that you follow in our description here, and you can have a free download of the notes that I put on the screen. But I want you to take notes that are relevant to your business, where these things prompt you to think about improvement in your business. All right, let's pull up the notes. Okay, as I said a moment ago, I want to start with some basic premises that have to do with defects in general. As obvious as it is to you that defects are wasteful, I want you to accept each of these things. And if you don't accept them, then ask yourself why. And just again, pause the video. This is all about, most management occurs between the ears, in your brain and thinking. So if you can't accept each of these things that I'm going to put out here up front, then ask yourself why, and sort of make a commitment to trying to accept these things going forward if you haven't in the past. Most of them will seem obvious, but I want you to accept these for the elimination of defects. The first one is defects will occur. That is a basic premise. It's a truth. You have to understand you are not perfect, your processes are not perfect, your products and services are not perfect. Defects will occur, but that isn't defeatist, and it's not an excuse. Don't use that as an excuse and say, oh, well, I'll just have to accept them. But you do have to accept that they will occur. And if you think that your products or services don't have defects, you're kidding yourself. And you don't want to have a culture where your people are misleading you and hiding the defects from occurring. I've told that anecdote on a few other occasions about the general manager of a Toyota factory who, when the Japanese executives came to visit, he came from the, this particular guy came from the competition from the Detroit 3 auto manufacturers. And when he was so proud of his production and the numbers, the volume of production, and the efficiency with which they're running forward, they asked him, where are your mistakes? Where are your defects? And he was caught off guard. And when he inquired as to what they meant, they said, we know that defects occur, and since you haven't shown us any, we want to know where you're hiding them. And that's the concept in your business. If you understand that defects will occur and you can't see them, that's because they're being hidden from you, either by your team or from another stakeholder, such as your customers. So accept that first premise. The second one is that defects can occur before, during, or after production. So often people are just focused on the production, and the defects are occur while you're delivering your service, like while you're conducting your service, or while you are manufacturing your product. Of course, it happens then, but it can happen further upstream. It can happen after production as well. The third one I've got up here is the cause of all defects is knowable and discoverable. So it just requires a little investigation, a commitment from yourself that if a defect is occurring, you don't have to accept that. Now, there may be a defect due to something outside of your control, but through degrees of separation from that cause, you will be able to mitigate that defect. Like maybe you have to switch a supplier or so forth. We're going to discuss all of that right now. But the premise here is that you can figure out what is causing a particular defect. And if you can, that means you can fix it, or you can at least minimize it. The next one is really important, and that is we will not knowingly ship defects. You need to have a commitment and a culture in your company that is we will not ship defects. And think of who your customer is. In the Toyota production system, the customer is the next person along the line. So if I'm making widgets and I'm installing component C out of A through Z to make the widget, my customer is the guy who's installing the component D, and his customer is whoever's installing component E, and so on, all the way down the line. And then the guy who's installing component Z, or Z if you're Canadian, his customer is perhaps the next person in like transport or the retail customer. Everybody thinks that the retail customer is the customer, but also the person further downstream in production is the customer. You never allow a defect to knowingly go from your part of production to the next person. And assuming that you deliver products or service to your customers, you also make sure that, to retail customers or to other businesses, you make sure that you will never knowingly deliver a product or service to somebody that is flawed in some way. Make a commitment to that and teach that to your team. We will stand behind our products and services. That's tied in with this. It's different than we will not knowingly ship defects, because some people, there's that scene in Fight Club where they do the math about how much would it take to not, how much money would it cost to not do a fix, and based on just accepting the lawsuits, like there's a cost involved in a recall or making a fix to a problem, and then there's another cost if we don't do that and we get sued, and there's this whole thing. Well, some companies actually do that. Some companies will ship a defect and think, well, it's only affecting every 10th product or whatever. It's not occurring every single time, so we'll just deal with it down the road and we will fix it when it comes up with a customer. That is a flawed logic. It's a bad concept. You need to not ship the defect, which means you fix it at the source and make sure that everybody, to your knowledge, everybody's getting the best product or service that you can. But the next one is we're going to stand behind them because we know that there may be something that slips through. We won't allow it to slip through if we know about it. But if something does slip through, we are going to stand behind our products and services. If you can't do that, you have no business being in business. You have no business delivering products or services. And that which is measured improves. If you accept that as a sort of a law, a natural phenomenon, then what is implied is you need to measure. So combine all these things and act upon these premises, and you will do a great job in reducing defects and dealing with the adverse effects of defects within your organization. All right, let's get into the causes of defects. Now, we said that there's a premise that defects can occur before, during, or after production. So before can be design. The defect, there may be a defect inherent in the design of your product or the design of the application of your service. So consider design as a possible place for these to start. Also, the raw materials, the components or the parts that you're using. Some of you are building something from scratch, from an actual commodity of some sort of raw material. Others of you are assembling components and harvesting something, or you're putting parts together. Whatever it happens to be, you can kind of think of the raw materials and the components as the parts as being further upstream, again, perhaps before production. And they may have defects inherent in those particular materials that you use. The process, so that's more to do with the during. So you have come up with your own process. Maybe you inherited that, or you're copying someone else. You've learned that as an apprentice, or you've come up with some proprietary process for delivering your service to customers, for manufacturing your product. And this is certainly an area where defects can occur. If your process contains other forms of Muda, for example, then that is often a cause of defects as well. So the process, also stakeholder communication. So it can be that you're just not communicating well with somebody on the line. There's all sorts of things. Think of all your stakeholders. As we go through your stakeholders, your vendors or your suppliers, perhaps you're not telling them, you're not communicating well with one another, and that leads to the raw materials problem or some kind of defect that occurs, that you get a substandard material or the wrong part to go into your process. If there's a communication issue with management, where management is not setting up mechanisms through which they can communicate really directly with all the other stakeholders, certainly that is a cause of defects in some of the process. With production personnel, that's the one that people tend to focus on, is, oh, I've got a defect, therefore it must be my frontline workers, the logistical people who are delivering. Maybe you have a business of trades and electricians, and you're having defects every now and then that you have to fix, that a customer is not happy with the work, or it didn't work as was intended, and you had to send the guy back out to the job site multiple times or whatever, and you focus on him. But is it perhaps communication between management and that person as to what the process should be? Transport personnel. So you might manufacture, you might design and manufacture the very best product or process to deliver a service, and then in shipping, something goes awry, and by the time your customer actually receives it, there is a problem. And you might say, well, that's for sure just manufacturing. That's an actual physical product, but it happens in services as well. If you think of the delivery as, you know, somehow getting between where you operate and where your customers operate, or where you may have to actually do your production of the service. So if you're visiting residential homes or people's places of business and you're late because you don't have good processes for scheduling and all that, that can be considered a defect as well. What about communication errors with your customers, and you didn't tell your customers the proper way that to use a particular product that you have, or just any type of communication error can lead to defects. Also, people, both the management and the production team members. Now, before I've mentioned both of those, but those are from a communication point of view. I'm also pointing out here that it can be due to your people having insufficient skill or aptitude. So maybe they're not capable of delivering the service that you offer. They just don't have this skill, or they lack the experience or expertise to be able to help you with your production in whatever way. So that comes down to your HR processes. A lack of training, once again, HR processes. What about failure to inspect? And that's both a management issue, where your management is failing to inspect what they expect of its production team, of its logistical people. That's part of management, but also your people doing quality inspection. So maybe somebody, my example of the electrician, he goes out, he does the work, but he fails to actually go through a checklist and make sure he's done everything correctly. and he's left the job site dirty and it's disappointed the customer, or he's left a particular plate off of the wall or something like that, or he's cracked something, or he scratched the paint somewhere, there's some kind of defect in the work from failure to inspect. Accountability failure. So this can be individual and organizational. So individually, you need as a manager, you need to hold your people accountable. You have to clarify your expectations of them, and then you have to hold them accountable. And if you're not doing that, that's a problem with individual accountability or organizational accountability. Like when we talk about standing behind your product, make sure that you take pride in your product and you go public with the idea that you're gonna warranty your product. You're going to guarantee satisfaction, you're gonna guarantee results. That's holding your organization accountable. So throughout your organization, you can say, guys, we have a culture of accountability here. We are accountable to the market. We are accountable to our customers. We stand behind everything. So let's say, for example, you have somebody who does shoddy work. That person knows that he will have to repair that work. He has to do the quality assurance and repair that work with no extra pay, as an example. And that's an accountability to an individual and the whole organization. If you understand this, then as an organization, you're accountable as well. Physical or mental fatigue happens with people. So make sure your people aren't overworked. And sometimes people have 2 and 3 jobs, or they're working so many hours because of the demands for your service. It's great when you're busy, but is your product starting to experience defects outside of the ordinary range that you've measured? And is it because your people are fatigued mentally, or maybe they're stressed out, something going on in their personal life? Another one is apathy. Sometimes a person just doesn't care. And that comes back to accountability, because if you are accountable, at least you'll catch those things and you won't ship those problems. And then you can discover whether or not you have some misaligned objectives, and maybe the person doesn't care because they're not being held accountable, like the example I gave where they have to go back and do their own work. If there's any rework necessary, that it's hurting the organization, but you're going to mitigate that a little bit by making sure that you align the incentives, so the person who's done the work originally wants to make sure it's done right, because he doesn't want to have to go back for free and redo it. That's just one example. Are there bonuses based on having records set for fewest defects and more sales, customer satisfaction, these types of things? Do your team members come away with pride in that because you've aligned the incentives? If not, you may have defects being caused by apathy. All right, let's move on. What else do we have? What about equipment and tools? This is certainly an area that causes defects, and you can understand that. If you have old or antiquated equipment, perhaps every now and then, think of an older piece of equipment that is sporadic in terms of the quality results that it produces. Poorly maintained equipment. So maybe it's not operating at optimum efficiency because it hasn't been maintained correctly. So you're making a note. You're going, oh, you know what? That's a good point. We haven't brought in the expert on that machine. And I do recall that we should have had that maintained once a year or whatever. Make sure that you're doing those things to eliminate defects. A machine that's broken or in need of repair. And we've all been there where we have some tool or piece of equipment that it kind of works, it sort of does the job, but it's not optimally working because it's broken. And I've got a particular example in mind within a shop that I know of where the technicians were avoiding using that because it was in need of repair. And it was, it didn't cost that much for management to just fix it. Outdated software is another one. You think of your computer when your computer is continually crashing, but this happens with all sorts of equipment. Most electronic equipment is, essentially all electronic equipment is run with computer chips, so they are computers essentially. And if the software, the firmware, the operating system needs updated, or you're running with old drivers, outdated drivers, or you're now integrating with newer with an API that integrates with a newer form of software or whatever, and you've got the older version, you can run into problems that cause defects. Maybe your equipment just simply needs calibration from time to time. Just the physical use of equipment sometimes brings it out of calibration. And have you got a process set up to reduce the number of defects because you are consistently and frequently calibrating your equipment to get the optimum performance. Also, your facility can be the cause of defects if it's disorganized. And we've all operated in an environment that's sort of messy and cluttered and disorganized. I would highly recommend you watch our video on 5S to understand how the cleanliness and the organization of your facility and your work area can really affect quality. If your workspace is dirty, of course, there could be dust that gets into the product. If you are in any kind of food industry, you want to make sure that it's really clean. Of course, you don't want any sort of contaminants getting into the food. So cleanliness is really something to focus on, obviously in food-related industries, but it is in all industries. You know, you don't want some sort of broken component or a little piece of plastic because of a cluttered work area getting in and rattling around in a particular product that you're making. And it may not affect the performance, but it can affect the quality still. It's still considered a defect. If your facility is too small, these things tend to arise where you're trying to cram too much capacity of work into a small workspace, and that can cause defects. All right, moving along. What about your packaging? Have you got insufficient protection like cushioning, padding to protect the product in the packaging? Because between the time that you finish making it and your customer uses it, it needs to be protected in some way. Maybe it gets scratched or scuffed or actually broken because of insufficient protection in the packaging. What about labeling in your packaging? If it's not labeled, then a person can have something upside down, or, you know, I think of that scene from A Christmas Story where he said, "Oh, look, fragile, must be Italian." And she's like, "I think that says fragile, dear." So make sure that your packaging is labeled to make sure that things aren't mishandled. Also, I one time purchased a bottle of cologne, and the packaging that it came in, when I didn't know how to open it correctly. It was, it's a Jean-Paul Gaultier, and it looks like it's a cylindrical can, and I didn't know how to open it. It turns out that the bottom just separates from the rest of it. You don't have to use a can opener or whatever. But when I tried to pull, it just sort of came apart and the bottle went flying, smashed on a hard surface, and the whole kitchen smelled like cologne for a month afterward. But that was the packaging, and you would say, well, that's not a defect, Mike. Well, it is. It was a defect in the customer experience. Remember, all we're trying to do here is drive value. We're trying to drive value, and one of the constituents of value is customer experience, and I was really annoyed by that experience. It's like, okay, what do I do here? And cologne's not cheap, and so it was a very disappointing experience for me. If there was some kind of instructions on the label or whatever that told me how to open it, I wouldn't have done that. And I've bought that cologne since, and I haven't had that problem again. Also, storage. If you have improper stacking, there can be damage that obviously could occur. Things that are more fragile on the bottom and they're getting crushed. Or you have exposure to the elements, or exposure to nature, exposure to light, moisture, heat, cold. What about products that you receive from the FedEx or the UPS truck and it's frozen or melted? These types of things. Are you giving consideration to storage after the fact? What about pests? Is it possible that mice could gnaw on your packaging or on the wires of a product or whatever because of improper storage? Or could insects get in there and gross out your customers? Think about storage. Also about transportation and delivery. And you see some of these things are repeating themselves. You want to make sure that during transportation that you have things properly labeled. I've received 2 different freezers that I purchased from Costco. They use an independent company to do their shipping, and both of them were damaged when they take off the box, they cut up the box and all that stuff. Both of them were damaged, and it was because they used, in the shipping portion, they used a forklift in a manner that they shouldn't have, and perhaps the packaging was unclear, or it could be the communication. Management may not have communicated well with the delivery drivers, like, do not use a forklift on this area, only lift from that area, or whatever. Mishandling, temperature control. Again, I gave examples of receiving frozen or melted products and that kind of thing. Also use. Now this one you may debate me on and say, well, these aren't defects, but I'm gonna come back to why it is. So if you have a product that is not used as intended, you have user error or mismatched applications, like it's actually meant to be a commercial, or it's being used in a commercial application, but you're selling it and you're marketing it as a personal application, a residential device, then those types of things can lead to premature wear and tear, or the product not operating as was intended, and your customer perception, your customer's let down, the customer experience is bad. Now we said at the beginning, you're gonna stand behind your products or services, and we also talked about poor communication, stakeholder communication between you, your company, and your customers may lead to defects, and it may lead to the perception of a defect. And you've all read on Amazon or other sites where there are reviews, and a person reviews, you might see like a ton of 5-star reviews, and then there's a 1-star review, and you think, well, that guy was using the product wrong. But I would argue there's still a defect there when the customer has a perception of a defect. He's not buying that again. He's in fact gone public telling people that he would not recommend this product. And even though it might be user error, it's incumbent upon you and your organization to communicate with your users, with your end customers, as clearly as possible. Create videos, create, diagrams and very visual, easy to use instructions. Like these days, nothing comes, even very sophisticated smartphones don't come with owner's manuals like they used to. We expect people to intuitively figure out how to use things. And people are just used to, you get a car, nobody looks at the owner's manual, they jump in the car, they want to just start driving. So what are you doing to make sure that your customer, you're mitigating for that possibility of user error, your customer misusing the application? Or further upstream in your sales process, are you making sure that you're qualifying the customer properly and matching them up with the proper product for their intended use? So as you see, there's a lot of different ways that you can work to try to mitigate and minimize the amount of defects that occur with your product or service. Look to all of these things. And look, this isn't by no means necessarily comprehensive. There's probably many other areas that contribute to defects in your products. And remember, just look at the more basic things. Start with design. Remember these original premises. Go back and accept those things, that defects can occur or can originate from before, during, or after production. You might think, well, once I've given it to the customer and it's in perfect condition and it's operating good, then it's no longer a defect. But I hope I've convinced you now we're gonna stand behind our product, and even if the customer misuses it, we may not be able to fully refund or replace, depends on your industry, but you should take some responsibility, do something for your customer, be empathic and take responsibility and say, oh yeah, I need to communicate. I want to minimize the chances of this happening again and again. And remember that concept at the beginning. I'm not going to go through the whole thing again, but if you think these defects aren't occurring, you are kidding yourself. They are occurring. You need to measure, and then it's all about trying to improve. Have some fun with your team. Forward this video and the playlist to your team. Make sure culturally you are all trying to eliminate waste and you're trying to affect positive change, especially with respect to defects and quality. Align those incentives. I think that's where I want to leave it today. I hope you got something out of this, and you'll leave a comment that lets me know some other examples and where defects have occurred. Is there something I left out, or do you want to push back and give some different ways of thinking about this, different ways that people can eliminate waste in general? When you leave a good comment and somebody in the community reads it, they end up learning, and that's really important because we need to learn from one another. Perpetual refinement.